please join me in welcoming Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I wanted to just kind of start out. I don't know if anybody had asked. I don't know what industries are represented in the room today. So could I get, just by a show of hands, how many folks are in public sector? How many are state, local, maybe water, wastewater, anything like that? No? How many folks are just commercial, just corporate world? Okay, so it's pretty much, all right. I didn't want to go too far down the public sector route if it wasn't necessary. So anyway, so yeah, thank you for the introduction. What we want to present from Cisco's perspective today is really, I think I was just talking to some other folks about, I do a lot of these, and you hear sort of the doom and gloom side of it, and it is intimidating, sometimes even overwhelming. But I think what Cisco's trying to do, as a major software company, which a lot of people don't know, we're one of the top 10 largest software companies in the world, if you didn't know that. But what we're trying to do is really begin the process of thought leadership. And I think one of the gentlemen who was asking about what he could do and who he could share his thoughts with had left. But Cisco has put together a big outcome study that we're going to start publishing on a regular basis. And what this is, and we're going to review it today, but for the most part, what it does is it goes and gathers all the information from the thought leaders in cybersecurity, and it comes back with consensus of what are the outcomes that they desire, what are the strategies they use to get there, and then sort of what Cisco's take on that. Okay, so there'll be some links here, and I think we're going to give you guys these prezos, but you can subscribe to this. So if you need to talk to your executive team about what your thoughts are, if you're leading IT or CISO, whatever you can subscribe to this to share these trends and thoughts. Okay, so it's really about what works. That's what we want to talk about. And if you think about, I was asked to sort of stay in the IT box, which I spent a long, long time in, so I was very comfortable doing that. But I do support OT, and I see that sort of confluence of IT versus OT. Frankly, I think that some of our biggest vulnerabilities are personnel, right? The complication of trying to talk as two different organizations as IT, OT, but also even disclosing that you've been breached, right? It's difficult to do that, and I think that that's where the bad guys sort of exploit things. Before I moved into this role, I was in public sector, and I was telling the team this earlier that, I'd gone into several meetings where the city was being held for ransomware. Just straight up, we walked in, they're like, our network is locked down, we want to talk to you guys about what happens when we get it back. And at the same time, I knew the account fairly well, and I knew the two groups didn't talk. And I just thought, makes me wonder if that was the vulnerability, right? And at the same time, I never heard that story in the news. It came and went. They probably paid the ransom and moved on down the road, right? So there's so many things when you think about it that the attackers really exploit in people, right? They want to make sure that they tell you, like, look, you don't need your company's name in the newspaper, right? So just pay the ransom and we'll leave. And it's those types of things that makes this so troubling, because you do need to disclose, and you do need to share information, and you do need to be forthcoming about it. And I think that that's something that we're trying to work on as an industry. Even some legislation, I understand that, cities, water, wastewater agencies, and different types of players in the public sector are being encouraged, like, hey, come forward with what happened to you. We need to know. We got to see what happened, and we need to study that, and there needs to be postmortem on it, right? But what we're going to talk about today is what we think works from the industry folks that we've surveyed. So we went out and surveyed 5,000 people across several different countries. And what we did was we started basically just gathering all the information and feedback from them after interviews. And we wanted to pull together across all these thought leaders in cybersecurity, right? So these are primarily CISOs. And we have customer advisory CISOs that we work with all the time, right? They'll send us information, we send them information. And there are folks who have us on retainer, so we do see a lot of the threats in a group that we call Talos at Cisco. But these are the outcomes that sort of bubbled to the top, right? They want to enable business, they want to manage risk, and they want to operate efficiently. And I think the challenge always is for IT, IT's got this sort of challenge of like trying to be cost effective, but also trying to innovate. And it's really tough, right? And you heard some of the different folks talking about, I've got all these old systems. And I think, unfortunately, IT's been put in a position to be the cost manager. And really that's also not helping, right? There needs to be some offense there that, look, we've got to innovate to get ahead. We've got to innovate to move our business forward and to protect ourselves. So hopefully that's going to change a little bit. But these are probably not things that surprise anybody, right? What may surprise you, though, is sort of what were the top 5 practices that everybody referenced across all the different things that we heard back These were the top 5 things that the best of the best kind of came back with, and then sort of by consensus, everybody else followed suit. These are the 5 areas that they thought that they needed to focus on, right? So we'll talk about each one of them, but again, when you're talking about the outcomes that they were trying to achieve, these were the sort of the fabulous 5, as Cisco calls it, of places to focus. So, as I mentioned, we surveyed 5,000 people, kind of came up with this, and again, you'll see there's the link here at the bottom, but you'll get the slides, so you can get this on a regular basis from us. At the end of the day, this is some of the data that came back when we did the study. Not everybody's going to have all 5 of those things that I put up there. We're going to detail the 5 out, but if you had all 5, your probability for success with cybersecurity goes up dramatically, right? If you've got all 5, and then there's varying degrees wherever you're at in that journey, right? So I think that at the end of the day, a lot of folks have a lot of legacy technology. A lot of folks are still on-prem, and if you think about what happened during the COVID sort of situation, right? A lot of folks were forced to work from home, and what Cisco then innovated, and what a lot of folks sort of shifted to, is a model called a SASE model. So you basically put all your users to the cloud, you put your company to the cloud, and you basically connect that way. That way folks can work from home, right? So you've now got this sort of system that's on-premise, used to be the only system, but what had happened during COVID was a lot of folks now authenticate through the cloud and connect that way, right? And so it does begin this journey of, consolidating the architecture and leveraging the cloud, but so many companies are still sort of on-premise legacy, right? Everything they have is in the 4 walls of their company. They may be connected to a DR down the street, a disaster recovery facility of some sort, if they're worried about tornadoes or whatnot, but they're not really, fully leveraging the cloud the way that they should. And there's a big reason for why that's important. Trying to keep up with the business. I think, it is tricky to keep up with all the updates that folks have. But one of the things that we noticed is that it's the cadence in which people focus on this. If you're looking at this as like an annual review, the difference between annual and quarterly is a big deal, right? So not to say that everybody's got to be, being in constant meetings about this, but there should be a process in place. You'll hear this theme throughout this presentation, that it's all about people, process, and technologies. And basically the quality of your people and the quality of your processes are critical as well. It's maybe the top issue. But just having a cadence that's a little bit higher frequency is really important. So, I think if you look at, of course Cisco likes this because we talk about, one vendor, we could give you everything, but it's not always reality. I think what they're leaning on here and what the feedback was is that, the more you can get with one vendor, the more you can automate, the more you can basically have one orchestration layer. And that's really critical because it does start to solve some of the problems of, well, OT wants to be by themselves, IT wants to be by themselves, right? But at the same time, there's overarching governance and compliance that you can still put over the both of them. They don't touch each other, they're not on each other's networks, but there's orchestration. So the CISO and whomever else is looking at that can pay attention to, general compliance across the enterprise. Okay, so, I think that, yes. So what this is saying is that this is talking about, having a single vendor kind of gives you a higher probability, right, of having the ability to succeed in cybersecurity. Meaning one vendor, the ability for all those different products to work together, the ability to orchestrate that in one layer and to automate that becomes a lot easier if you have one vendor. That's not realistic for everyone, but this is something that sort of came out of this study, right? And I when I think about this as somebody who's in the field all the time, a customer's not just going to go through and rip out everything and put in a different product, right? It's a life cycle. There's a reference architecture that you work towards. I think that, although this is sort of the feedback that we got, and we do support a lot of the, larger firms that they do use a lot of Cisco products, but I think the reality is you're going to find there's legacy products in a lot of those environments. Can you get those to be automated? That's sort of the tricky part. That's the struggle. If you have the ability to coordinate those and to have that orchestration layer for automation, then the probability of your success goes up dramatically, right? There's a lot of third-party companies that just do that, right? They'll take a little bit of Cisco, a little bit of somebody else's product, a little bit of somebody else's product, and the orchestration layer takes care of it for you. There's still some weaknesses there for automation because we're not always compatible with everybody, but that's what this is driving at, right? The closer you can get to one vendor, the better, but the reality lies somewhere between those 2 points, right? Okay, so I think that this really kind of goes into the same discussion around the way that you're integrated in your stack, right? Because if you think about security today, right, there's several different types of products that you would use in a typical security environment, right? You've heard multi-factor authentication. You'll hear us and Rockwell talking about firewalls. There's identity services engines. There's a lot of different layers of security technology, right? So wherever we come into a customer's environment, we have to kind of take what we have in front of us and build a reference architecture from that. But the more integration you have, the better, as I'd mentioned, right? So this is just some of the comments that we got back, right? This security debt comment seems to be a current one that I keep hearing about. And effectively what they're referring to there is folks kind of leave older problems in the dust, kind of don't go back and look at things that they've got already installed, right? So for example, you might have firewalls. You're kind of like, okay, we got firewalls. Let's go look at multi-factor authentication. But they really need to be looking at all of it holistically all the time. And it's called security debt. That means you're not paying attention to something that you left in the past, and it may not be modern, it may not be current, and that could be a vulnerability, right? So you'll hear this term security debt. That's effectively what it means. And that refresh cycle of going from an annual cycle to a quarterly cycle means you've got all those products on a regular cadence for review. And we can see, like, well, the firewalls are like 4 years old. Maybe we should start talking about those again, right? I know we just paid for those, but maybe we should see if we're on a modern version, what types of platforms are they running on, and how can we make sure everything's staying current, right? So you'll hear this term security debt a little bit in the industry, we believe. And this is just talking about that cloud-based product strategy. And I think, when you're talking about industrial, they get worried about having connectivity to the cloud, and they're not always going to have that. But what we're seeing is IT is working closer with OT with regards to things like preventative maintenance, different types of sort of metrics that they want to look at. It's not the OT network, but it's a network next to theirs, et cetera. So, and the reason I bring that up is because when you talk about cloud with somebody in the industrial space, they freak out. Like, nope, we don't have any internet connectivity to the floor. Like, that's just sacred. It's DMZ, air gapped. We don't do that. And so what's happening is there's a parallel network with that. So, most of the environment could go to the cloud, and that enables orchestration and automation, right? So when I say, and I want to make sure you guys understand the terms I'm using here, right? Orchestration means across all your products, you can basically have some governance, right? Automation means it's automatic, meaning something happens in one area, and there's a chain of events that happens in that process, right? And that's automated as much as you can get it, right? So if there's a breach on somebody's mobile phone, it went into the email server, we know what subnet that is, we know exactly where somebody could move around on the network, the automated process would start locking things down, right? And that's what that means. When you're cloud connected across all those independent platforms, it's easier to do that, right? Okay, so threat detection and incident response. I talked a little bit earlier about people, process, and technology, and this is probably one of the toughest things, especially for the industrial side, but also even for IT, right? Keeping good security folks, having good processes, and having current technology is really a struggle. It's not usually something, if you think about it, just a few short years ago, this was not like the largest expense for an IT organization, but it's quickly becoming the largest expense for an IT organization. It used to be about, block and tackle servers, data center equipment, things that you would need in your budget, but that's shifting, right? Cybersecurity is kind of becoming the number one expense. But at the same time, the quality of your people make a big difference, right? And we'll go into that. So you can see here from the findings that if you've got all three, you have a big boost in your cybersecurity success, right? This is a really interesting slide. So this is basically saying that, think about if you're an IT organization, you've got your own internal security staff. Your ability to design processes may be a little bit lacking. If you've got just an internal team and all you see is your own environment, maybe you're not thinking about best practices for processes and the way that you go through, let's say you do go to a quarterly cadence when you look at your processes. If you're just an internal team only in a corporation, you may have only your short view of the world, and there may be other things you need to factor in. So sort of the discussion is insource or outsource here, right? That was the question. And what came back was the mean time to recovery or to repair was much better with the internal team, right? So your internal staff was going to be way quicker at getting you back up. And somebody mentioned before they recovered from a malware attack in 6 hours, which is unbelievable. But if you've got your act together, sure, do restore and overwrite the bad guys, and there you go, right? There's some folks that can do that. But this is a little controversial because obviously, if you go into any environment and start talking about outsourcing, folks get a little nervous, right? But what this is saying, really, what nets out of this, is that use outside sources to come in and look at what you're doing, look at your processes, give advice, but your internal teams probably aren't faster for mean time to recovery, right? They're going to be way faster than an outsourcer at getting you back online. So it's sort of an interesting finding. And it does sort of lend itself, when you talk to your executive teams, that look, it's good to have an outside party come in and look at what we're doing to make sure we are not missing things or that we've got the best processes that we can leverage, okay? So when you leverage Intel, this is an interesting slide too. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that folks that don't leverage intelligence typically have, their view of the world, it's almost like ignorance is bliss, right? They kind of feel like they don't have any security problems, so they answer the survey that way. Like, no, we don't really have many issues with that. They're not paying attention to what the threats are around them, and they may not even realize what's hitting their firewalls all the time, right? So what this slide is showing is that on the left-hand side are folks who don't have very good detection and response, but who are actually somewhat vulnerable. And then once that realization happens and they start thinking about, oh my gosh, now I see I'm being attacked 5,000 times a day, like I think Rockwell had mentioned, right? I'm getting attacked continuously. There's a little bit of fear and sort of, they have to think about how to prepare for that. What happens if one of those gets through, et cetera? I got to let the executive team know we need to spend more money. I do have vulnerabilities, right? And then once you sort of have your arms around the fact that, yeah, I am leveraging threat intelligence. I know how many people are hitting my perimeter, and I know what sort of threat surface I have. And I'm also incorporating that now into my active reference architecture. The probability for success goes way up, right? I mean, number one, you want to know that somebody's trying to get into your company, right? If you don't know that, if you don't have any idea that you're kind of a hot target, that you need to go and tell folks, and you got to start preparing for that. So that's what this is talking about. In that, the folks who didn't leverage threat intelligence felt like, we're fine, right? But they just may not know, right? Automation is better than as a supplement as opposed to being the sole thing, okay? So what this is talking about is, if you have no automation with a strong staff, you've got a 73% chance of good success with cybersecurity, right? If you've got extensive automation but a weak staff, 79%. That's not bad because you've got a third party helping you out. It's automating and monitoring all of your systems. And so, hey, not bad, right? If you don't have either, you're not doing too well. You got a weak staff, no automation, no outside party helping you. You've got a pretty low sort of probability of having cybersecurity success. But when you have all the above, it goes way higher, right? So that means you've got a good security team, you've got a good third party helping you out, you've got cloud, you've got automation, and you've effectively got the ability to respond and monitor in a very good, efficient way, okay? That's what this means. This talks about people, and I think, the people question comes up quite a bit. I even within my partners and within my major global industrial partners, there's a giant gap, not a gap, but giant demand for obviously more cybersecurity professionals. And I think, part of what we were talking about earlier as a group is, there's a lot of things that Cisco does and a lot of things that Rockwell does, and even the military around trying to get folks to come into technology. Network Academy is one of the things that Cisco does, if you haven't heard about that. We also have training opportunities at, I think it's UW-Madison, where Cisco and Rockwell put in a lab. I just inherited it, so I don't know everything about it. But there are a lot of areas where we're trying to invest to sort of offset that. And that means, getting veterans involved in those programs, getting other folks that want to make career moves into those programs, et cetera. So Cisco's trying to also spend some money to get more talent out there. It's a pretty big issue for us, right? The number of security professionals that we need as a country versus what we have is sort of alarming if you look at it. But she's basically saying that, you need quality people. And that's true, but we just need people in the field. I think it's a little bit more simple than that. We need more people doing it. This talks about incident response teams, and it kind of is redundant with what we had talked about before, that, it is about people, process, and technology. But, I think that review process of what you have or what you don't have is really what keeps getting highlighted here, right? And I don't know how many folks here today do, just by a show of hands, how many folks review their cybersecurity strategy on a quarterly basis? One. How many do it on an annual basis? Okay, so the majority is annual, right? Maybe somewhere in the middle lies the truth. If 6 months is better than a year, let's try that, right? But I think this is sort of calling out, folks that just do this every day, all day long, they're more or less, you can see the amount of attacks that they have or the vulnerabilities that they've suffered or the attacks that they've suffered through went down dramatically when it went to a quarterly schedule, right? And that all ties to this with incident response. So prompt disaster recovery. This is kind of an interesting slide, right? That if you think about disaster recovery, it really involves a lot of things, more than what Cisco does, right? You need backup and recovery. You got to think about, what is it exactly that you're trying to protect in your business, and that goes along with that cybersecurity review. But what this is alluding to is that if you don't have 80% of your mission critical systems covered, then you are at a big weakness for not being able to recover, right? So what does that mean, right? That could mean failover servers, that's backup and recovery of your data, that means redundant networks, or whatever it is that you think you need. And when I talk to different customers, some folks will actually throw out there that, my downtime is X amount per hour. And they know what that number is. It's pretty interesting, right? Other folks don't really think about that. They've never thought about it yet. Like, if we went down, if my manufacturing went down, I wouldn't know. Or they would know, like, hey, I'd be in big trouble. But at the same time, they don't know what the dollar value of that downtime is. And I think for someone like Cisco and myself as a technology sales guy, right, which is effectively what I do, that downtime number is really critical, right? If you don't have the tools to recover within an hour, well, what was the cost per hour of downtime? If it's $2 million an hour, well, I would think that would be a pretty good place to start for a budget, right? If you want me to recover in a matter of minutes, I'm going to need a lot more technology and a lot more people. And so all this goes to the cyber insurance conversation, which you'll hear about later, right? And Cisco has guides along those lines that we'll share with you guys as a follow-up. Cisco's got sort of a review that we just did. I haven't read it all yet, but it's basically alluding to the fact that there's cybersecurity insurance that's out there. What do you need? What do you not need? And we're giving you sort of our take on cybersecurity insurance, right? But effectively, it's something to think about in your cybersecurity review meetings, right? Is what is the cost for our downtime? What's it worth for us to be able to fail over and or to be able to do a backup and recovery scenario within an hour? What if it was a whole day that it took us to do it? What would that cost, right? And that kind of gives you, with the executive team, that kind of gives you a way to measure out, like, hey, if our downtime for an entire day is $20 million, we should be putting more money towards this, right? I mean, if you want me to perform against that as a metric, then I'm going to have more funding and more resource and more acknowledgement as a team, right, as a security team. But I thought this was interesting that you need to be covering 80% of your critical systems if you really want to succeed. I think this is what's really interesting is I think this is the slide that talks about testing your business continuity, which I found this somewhat comical being in the industrial space right now, because an industrial environment would never let anybody test anything, right? There's no way you're going to randomly come in here and try to take a server down, because people will be in big trouble if we do that. I think the IT groups have this view of the world, like, hey, let's just let's hire somebody to do active defense, which means I'm going to hire somebody to try to hack in the network. Let's see if they can do it, right? That's cute and all in IT, because they can basically just refresh a server or whatever and come back up. Your email runs slow for an hour and it's okay, nobody's in any big trouble. You don't do that when you're manufacturing tinfoil or diapers or consumer packaged goods, right? You don't just go test taking a server down or attacking something. So this is a little bit one-sided, and it's purely an IT view of the world. But what they're saying is, and I think there's a military quote in here if I didn't see it. I'm a Marine, so I enjoyed seeing this, that no mission is successful the first time, right? There's almost always some high probability of failure because it's the first time you've ever done it, right? Your probability goes up dramatically if you go through that active drill. And guess what? That's why the military constantly does exercises, right? When I was in the Pacific, we did 1 million different exercises in the Pacific, and it was so we could practice. And I don't think that many companies think about that. Like, how often do you go through an actual event, like a mock event? Like, hey, somebody just took our network down. What do we do now, right? And it may not be that you want to actually live through it, but you want to at least have a process and procedure thought of what do we do? What's the first thing we do, right? And that was some of the questions that I was getting asked, as I was telling you, when I'd go into a meeting. They're like, well, our network is locked down, and we need to kind of talk to you guys about what we should be doing. And I'm thinking, it's a little bit late for that. I hope you had backups, and I hope but at the same time, thinking about sort of like, how do we pressure test our system? And there's a lot of things that Rockwell can do for you there and that Werner can do, right? Meaning that those types of services are things that Cisco really leans on the channel to deliver. We do some of it, but for the most part, a lot of those one-time services are very important, and there's so much demand for it. We really lean on our channel to bring that. So if anybody's looking for that, let us know. So, but I think, 2.5 times more likely if you can actually kind of go through a drill, which of course, makes sense. Okay, so this chaos thing again kind of goes down that same track. Obviously, manufacturing would never allow this, but at the same time, this is sort of a best practice that came back from CISOs. And talking about that for a minute, now that I'm in industrial, most of the time, but I do talk a fair amount to CIOs and CISOs. They're still an advisor to OT. There's always this interesting dynamic of sort of, people in budget and power and things like that IT and OT may sort of have different priorities for. But at the same time, the overarching governance and compliance can be done with the cloud, like I had mentioned, right? The CISO and the CIO may not manage your network, but they're going to have input if you're in the manufacturing space, right? So although this may not apply, like I don't think that the CISO could ever get anybody in manufacturing to let them randomly try to break their network. It's still a best practice, and it's still something to think about for the other part of your business, right? Somebody before was saying, when you say OT, do you mean like HR? Like, we're making some assumptions here as technology companies. When we say OT, we're meaning manufacturing, right? So HR, ERP, CRM, all that stuff is classically IT, right? So yeah, you could mess with an HR server for a minute if you wanted to, right? It wouldn't really cause anybody any major downtime costs, right? You could mess with the email server, but you don't go mess with the manufacturing environment, right? So these are points to think about, but does it fit everybody? Maybe not. This is really sort of, again, talking about, the processes and what you should think about when you do it. I would encourage you to get onto the subscription for this, because a lot of these folks have really good quotes and things that they're thinking about. But, it was mentioned before to understand your assets, and you've heard already today a little bit about automation, right? And leveraging the ability to have that automation capability. And I think, it's really a matter of I think most companies are going to need some kind of a service to come in and help them, as we talked about, that a lot of the internal groups of a company are not going to have the ability to have like the best practices because they can't see anything but themselves, right? So you should have somebody come in to look at what you're doing. But then at the same time, those will be the best teams that you can use to recover, et cetera. So this next slide is a little busy, but I wanted to kind of go through it with you because I think once you understand what it is, it makes sense, right? On the left side, these are sort of the outcomes that folks were targeting. These are sort of the things that all fit into the 3 buckets, right? And you can see the acronyms there, right? Enabling business, managing risk, and operational excellence, basically is what I'm calling it, right? But what it's saying is, of the left side outcomes, these practices are being used against those outcomes, right? And you can see there's sort of a cluster here, like a heat map, if you will, of where different folks in the survey answered what they were doing to try to achieve those outcomes, right? And I don't expect everybody to read all this and take it all in, but for the most part, I thought this was a pretty interesting chart because it's not just Cisco saying this, it's 5,000 people in a survey and then us distilling it down to say, okay, this is what they were doing. These were the folks that were they're doing this in practice and where they were paying attention to what they wanted to accomplish. So, I think one of the interesting things that, since I'm running a little bit early here, I'll just talk a little bit loosely about some things. I think that, when you go into, as Cisco's looking at, manufacturing or just generic IT, one of the things we're seeing that's happening, and I don't think many people are thinking about it, is, you hear about IoT, industrial IoT, or just IoT in general, Internet of Things. A lot of the stuff that Cisco's involved with these days really is kind of moving away from the core IT and OT network, right? I mean, I talked about building a parallel sort of monitoring and preventative maintenance network in OT, for example, right? There's a lot of sort of new things being added to the network. And somebody mentioned before, like, why do we have so many more attacks going on? It's because people work from home or there's new employees or what have you. I have a different perspective on that, right? There's a lot of solutions that we're working on where folks are saying, hey, I want to go out and put IoT devices across all of my intersections in a city. Or I want to put, IoT devices on all my water, wastewater infrastructure in a municipality, right? Think about that. They didn't have connectivity there before, right? So like one of the projects we're working on with Rockwell right now, which is very interesting, it's water, wastewater, but it still applies, is looking at, there's a lot of compliance pressure on water, wastewater from not only a cybersecurity perspective, but also an EPA perspective, right? Meaning, what's your leakage for your infrastructure, right? And it's shocking to know this, but the EPA claims that most cities in the United States have a leakage rate of over 30% of their water, wastewater infrastructure, which is kind of shocking, right? And that's, in some areas, they've just got water everywhere, so it's not a big deal. I live in San Diego, that's a big deal for us. But at the same time, how much electricity is getting lost? You're pumping water into leaky pipes, you have to maintain pressure. Just kind of giving you an example of what that use case is. So how do they monitor that? What's the solution they want to put in place? There's one pump station for every 5,000 homes on average in a city. It varies if you're hilly or if you're not hilly, if you're downhill, whatever, right? So think about that. In a city that's, a couple million people, now you've got all these pump stations we're going to now connect that were never connected before, right? There's a whole new threat surface there, right? Think about the projects where folks are putting in smart meters for homes, right? Some of those are what's called AMRs. That means a truck drives down the street and it's capturing all your billing information while the truck drives by. Is that secure, right? And now we're talking about electric vehicles. So Cisco's getting involved in a lot of the new electric vehicle stuff that's coming to the United States, right? I work with other large global industrial partners that are heavily involved in energy, right? So if you're a building and you just basically reopened your workplace, and we see a lot of this, and like, oh, we're going to bring the workforce back. We've got to think about how they're going to basically have these, hot cubicles or cubicle sharing arrangements, whatnot. A lot of the thought processes now for buildings are, I've got people with electric vehicles that come to work. How am I going to put something in place for them? It's one of the things I'm getting asked about every day is, you're going to have any charging stations, right? Well, now you've got electric vehicles that are authenticating to a network to do a transaction so they can charge. That's also a threat surface, right? So just think about sort of where we're headed with technology. And it makes a whole lot of sense when you start thinking about how many more new areas there are to take advantage of, right? One of the, it's not in this one, but it was in one of the ones prior, about COVID. COVID was going to cause 500 million new applications to be written. It's one of the quotes that was in there. And this was according to just a giant survey. And I was thinking to myself, 500 million, I mean, come on, this is marketing, kind of getting a little loose, 500 million. But then I started thinking about it, and all these projects I've been involved in, there's a whole bunch of new applications that were never there before, just in several sort of verticals that I pay attention to. Smart buildings, oil and gas, healthcare, education. We all started buying products differently, right? You all have deliveries coming to your house where maybe you didn't before. All those applications to place your order, deliver your order, track your package, those are all sort of opportunities to engage with your device, and they all become new threat surfaces, right? So it's a pretty wild time that you're in. So anyways, this is something you guys will get, but I at first when I read this, I thought, wow, this is kind of simple. But at the same time, sometimes simple is really good, because sometimes the best solutions are very elegant and simple. They don't have to be overly complex, where you got to sit down and think about like 200 items you've got to check in a security environment, right? Sometimes it's just literally, what are the things I can pick off first? And where can I start with a reference architecture journey, right? And I think that's really what you should think about, right? If I'm going to put together a security plan, I'm not going to go tackle everything. I've got products that still have to live out their life cycle. I had an expectation that that investment would last 3 years, 5 years. I'm going to let that play out. But if you've got a reference architecture for where you want to be in a couple years, you can start thinking like, okay, well, we don't have multi-factor authentication today. Let me add that, right? And I still got firewalls. We'll check on those, quarterly review, right? But I think the important part is having a reference architecture for where you want to be in 2 years, right? What are the things I should be adding? What new devices are coming onto my network that I should protect? And there's some crazy statistics that we see out there. Like multi-factor authentication, it's being claimed now could stop 90% of the breaches we've seen. I saw some quote like that from Microsoft. I think Cisco even has quotes like that too about multi-factor authentication, right? And that means anytime you log into any application inside your corporate network, you have to authenticate that on your mobile phone. Just think of it that way, right? And Cisco does that. So everything I do, I use my phone probably about 50 times a day just logging into servers, because of course we don't want to get breached. That'd be pretty embarrassing, right, if Cisco got breached. But anyway, so just some things to think about. And with regards to developing that reference architecture, obviously Werner has the capability to help you with that from the manufacturing side, probably even some on the IT side. But, that's something that I would highly recommend, is starting to think about, where do I want to be in a couple years? What do I really want to have in-house? Because then you can start getting quotes for those things. You can start talking to executive leadership about why it's important and budgeting it out. Everybody understands that, hey, every 6 months we're going to put the next step of that reference architecture in place, and I'm going to need money for that, right? And by the time I get to the end of 2 years, I'm going to start replacing probably the first thing that I put in, right? Within a few months, I'm going to need to replace the first part. So just think about the reference architecture. If you don't have one, I highly recommend it. I've been doing technology for 30 years, and that's a tried and true methodology in every aspect of IT or OT, is where in the world are we going and how fast do we want to get there, right? Okay, so resources and next steps. Before I kind of go into the last part of this, one of the things I'll just do sort of a shameless commercial for Cisco. There's a lot of newsletters and a lot of blogs and a lot of really good information that comes out, right? And it's not overly salesy from us. We try to kind of be careful about trying to sell people stuff. But one of the things that people don't realize is that we have a really, really deep industrial solutions group, right? And so Cisco, a few years ago, really made an investment in hiring people from these different fields. People that were former police officers to look at public safety, folks that were former teachers to look at education, nurses to look at healthcare, right? There's a lot of industrial expertise at Cisco. I don't even think it's on here, but we have if you have, I'll send it when I send a follow-up email to you all, but we have an interface, or a portal rather, called Portfolio Explorer. And it allows you to come into the industrial areas that we've got expertise in. And we define sort of the top use cases that we see all the time. We'll show you the partners we're working with to address those use cases, and we kind of show you the validated designs that we've got done for them, right? So if you're in healthcare, you can go in there and see what they're thinking about. If you're in manufacturing, you can see that, oil and gas and so forth, right? But this is really just talking about, some of the things that we've looked at from a security perspective, but Cisco holistically has a lot of depth in certain industries. We don't cover everything, right? I mean, we can't have somebody on staff for every little thing, but the big ones we cover. One of the things that about 2 weeks ago, I was presenting with the Major General's peer in Indianapolis, and I thought one of the really interesting slides they put up, which I didn't realize, is that they've sort of categorized what are the critical industries that they think about, what keeps them awake at night. And it's things you would think about, right? Water, wastewater, the electric grid, public safety networks, agriculture. Cisco, coincidentally, kind of has the same overlay on a lot of those, right? So a lot of those industries that were identified as mission critical for our country are also, a lot of them are the same things that Cisco's focused on. It's probably because they're big and they spend a lot of money, and we have a lot of customers in those spaces. So just keep in mind, if you have a specific industry you're interested in, ping me, ping anybody here at Werner, and we'll run it down and get you the subject matter experts that we have. It's not uncommon to have folks just ask for somebody from our ISG group to sit in on a meeting with them and their team and just listen to what they're thinking and give feedback and just act as an advisor, right? So we do a lot of that. Okay, so this is the study, right? The link to the study, which you'll get. And there's some other things that we put out. If you just pay attention to, and it's hard to pay attention to everybody because there's an awful lot of technology companies out there, but Cisco does have a fair amount, like I had said, of blogs, newsletters, thought leadership that we're trying to put out there to help people. We're getting a lot of questions like what you heard from the gentleman before who I think left, of like, what am I supposed to do, right? How am I supposed to answer these questions? Or what? I'm just a small business. How can I tackle all of this, right? Sadly enough, we didn't see what 5,000 people said they were doing to tackle some of these issues. But definitely subscribe and get yourself in the loop on some of these things, okay? These are just some quotes from different folks that are in this advisory group, and you'll get these, so I don't necessarily need to go through them all. This is just folks talking about how the outcome study's been helpful for them. And I don't know, how many folks in the room are in a CIO or CISO role? Okay, a few. All right. I think the struggle that I see as a guy who's been selling services and technology and everything for so long, I think that the CIO and the CISO sometimes get a bad rap, right? That they're not innovating or they're not staying up with technology, or you hear these different quotes coming out of different, for whatever reason, you'll hear that the CIO is not innovating. And then we hear this trend of like, well, now there's shadow IT. People have gone off to some SI to help solve their technology problems because IT couldn't keep up, or IT was too expensive, or all these different things. I think just in general, this is my personal observation, I think that sometimes the CIO is pressured to go become a cost manager. And I see them more or less aligned with procurement about how to buy things cheaper, right? Which may or may not be the right strategy all the time. But for the most part, they do struggle to have credibility to the executive team. How do I, as a CIO, go in and say, look, you're giving me $10 million a year as a budget, and I need 20. I need to double my budget next year, right? And I think things like this, because they're simple and they're somewhat easy to understand, that's why I was actually sort of like, hey, this is kind of simple. It seems blatantly obvious, but it may not be obvious to your CEO, right? He may not know this, and he may say like, wow, well, this is a consensus across 5,000 people. So, I mean, how am I going to argue with that, right? And you could probably shoot holes in this somewhere if you wanted to. But the point is I think the outcome survey is really built to give the CIO and the CISO, Chief Data Officer, all these different roles that we keep hearing about, Chief Digital Transformation Officer, there's a lot of new roles out there. This is a way for them to more or less give the CEO, the COO, the CFO, CCO, whatever you've got to cover, to give them some reading materials. Like, hey, read this. And then we're going to have a meeting about it. But I'm going to give you sort of a consent agenda here that I want you to read first, right? So that's really the intent. And that's what all these quotes are about, right? It's just like, hey, this really helps me tell my executive leadership what's going on. It helps them understand it because it's really simple. It can be very complex if you dig into it, but at the high level, it is fairly simple. Okay, questions? Any questions for Cisco? I mean, we're a big company. I'm sure somebody's got questions for us, right? A lot of people don't even know what Cisco really does. It's really interesting. If you ask people what Cisco does, they'll think, oh, you guys make switches. Yeah, we make switches. We're also a really large software company. We also own WebEx. You know, we're one of those guys. We do a lot of things. Anybody have any questions about today's prezo, or any things they want to throw out? All right, last chance. So what I'll do is, I don't know if you guys are planning to give this presentation out, but I'm certainly open to it. You can have the prezo, the links will be in there, and you can use it as necessary. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.